Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed your cup of tea. My name's Kenny Farquharson. I'm a political journalist with The Times, writing a column for its Scottish edition. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session. If, as a result of Brexit, you're fed up of the constitutional debate dominating politics, squeezing out every other rational, sentient thought, with nothing else getting a look in, then spare a thought for those of us in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast who have known nothing else for the last 20 years. It does mean, though, that we in the fringes, the Celtic fringes, have long been familiar with many of the concepts that have come to dominate Brexit. Subsidiarity, sovereignty, divergence. These are all concepts that are very familiar to us because they've been part of how we have lived our lives and played our politics for that time. And yet there's a real sense in which Brexit is forcing the devolved governments and the countries that they represent to look afresh at some of the most basic assumptions. And I think we got a taste of that from the conversation with Bernard Jenkin earlier on, as to what we can assume are devolved issues and what are actually going to be important to have as British issues. And I think questioning some assumptions is what I hope we're going to do over the next hour. Very good panel for you, and I'll just introduce them very briefly to you. There's Professor Rogen Awan-Scully here, who is Professor of Political Science at the Welsh Governance Centre at the University of Cardiff, and he's the author of a forthcoming book, The End of British Politics, ? A question mark which begs many other question marks. There's Iain Macwhirter, who's a fellow journalist. He's a political commentator for the Herald and the Sunday Herald newspapers. Also an author. He wrote a very good book called Disunited Kingdom, How Westminster Won a Referendum and Lost Scotland. And he's widely acknowledged as the second best political commentator in Scotland. Then we have Dr. Katy Hayward. Katy is a reader of Queen's University in Belfast, with a particular focus on the transition from conflict to post-conflict communities. And finally, Professor Dan Wincott, and Dan holds the Blackwell Law and Society Chair at Cardiff University, and his particular focus is devolution, territorial governance, constitutional law, and welfare provision. I'm going to ask each of them to make their opening remarks. I'll pick up on a couple of things that they've been saying, and then we'll open it out to you guys there. So, first of all, please welcome Roger.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kenny. Wales voted for Brexit against almost all estimates of its apparent economic self-interest, and to the undisguised horror of the overwhelming majority of the native political class. Nonetheless, a Leave vote it was. For the first few months after that Leave vote, the Welsh Government, at times working in partnership with Plaid Cymru in the Assembly, concentrated mainly, I think, on developing an understanding of and seeking to articulate the particular Welsh concerns, notably economic concerns in relation to Brexit, and trying to push forward its obvious economic interests in the softest of Brexit's possible. I say it's had thus far conspicuously little success in advancing those interests. In the period since the general election, though, attention has shifted somewhat more towards the Brexit and devolution dimension. And here I think in understanding what the Welsh Government has been trying to do, it's worth just mentioning two concepts that scholars of devolution and regionalism across the world tend to use. We tend to understand two dimensions of regional empowerment. One, which we have great familiarity with in the UK, is self-rule, which is advanced to a substantial degree in the non-English nations of the UK. The other is shared rule, the idea that the constituent parts of the state participate in the governing of the whole. And that's a dimension which has not merely not been greatly developed in the UK, but indeed is a dimension which I think we have very little understanding of in the UK. In the immediate wake of the general election last year, the First Minister of Wales, Carwyn Jones, launched a rather ambitious new Welsh Government policy paper on Brexit and devolution. And this document, which in part picked up on Jones' long-standing interest in a constitutional convention, reshaping the entire constitutional structures of the UK, called for deeper and more sustained cooperation between devolved governments and the UK, and talked specifically, and I quote, about a shared governance approach. And I was talking there specifically about what you do with these powers which are repatriated from the EU, notably in devolved areas such as agriculture, the environment and fisheries. But in a sense, Carwyn Jones was seeking to use the opportunities offered by Brexit to advance a broader political agenda which he has held to for some time. Now, those attempts, as with earlier attempts to advance Welsh economic interests, have been conspicuously unsuccessful. Indeed, far from advancing a new devolutionary dimension of shared rule, what has been occupying the mind of the First Minister and much of the Welsh Government in the last few months has been, well, what they see as battling to resist an erosion of Welsh self-rule. The approach that the UK government is taking to the withdrawal bill, notably Clause 11, which Bernard Jenkin, certainly in his scripted comments, I thought gave a very good introduction to earlier, has been strongly objected to by the devolved administrations. I won't go over, and I think Bernard Jenkin did this quite well, the basic reasons for the objection. But I think what is more interesting perhaps than the legal side of this is the political side. It's perhaps no great surprise that in the case of Scotland, we have an SNP-led government that believes fundamentally in independence, that it is finding reasons to object to the manner in which the UK government is handling certain powers which are going to be coming back in devolved areas from the European Union. What I think is far more striking than the case of Scotland is the case of Wales here. We have in Wales a Labour government, fundamentally a unionist government, albeit one of a strongly devolutionist unionist shade, which nonetheless, despite that, and despite the long-term toxic nature of the relationship between the Labour Party and the SNP, nonetheless that Welsh government has been consistently over the last 9 months or so allying with the SNP-led Scottish government and against the government of the United Kingdom on this issue. And if nothing else, I think it's an eloquent, telling measure of the extent to which the domestic politics of Brexit have been appallingly handled, that we find the unionist Labour Welsh government standing shoulder to shoulder with the Scottish SNP government in the starkest of opposition to the position taken by the UK government of Theresa May. That standoff continues. Bernard Jenkin put, I think, very much, certainly in his unscripted comments, a position which is very similar to that of the UK government. The position of the Welsh government, I think, is conditioned not only by objections to what the UK government is doing on Brexit, but in a broader sense by another issue that Bernard Jenkin, I think, was quite right to mention, which is a problem of intergovernmental trust. And this is a problem which certainly in the case of Wales goes back to before the Brexit referendum. And in particular, I would point to the lengthy process which culminated eventually in the 2017 Wales Act, which reshaped significant aspects of the Welsh devolution settlement and changed Wales from a conferred powers model to a reserved powers model much closer to the fundamental principles that operate for the Scottish and Northern Irish devolved settlements. And that process was so badly handled by Whitehall and created so much fundamental ill will and lack of trust between governments at the two levels. So I think that has been a great part of the underlying lack of trust which has persisted into these detailed discussions on Brexit and helps explain why the Welsh government are so reluctant to trust assurances from the UK that in the long term these powers will come down. I mean, the UK's government's position was summarised recently by some wag as the Father Ted Crilly approach, that the powers will just be resting at Westminster for a while. So we have this position at the moment. There is sort of a standoff on the EU withdrawal bill between the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales and the UK government. Now, I'm no constitutional lawyer, but my understanding of the Supreme Court's judgment in the Miller case is that ultimately the UK government and Parliament can force this through. But they would do so likely at considerable political cost and continuing these problems of lack of intergovernmental trust. The only certainty at the moment appears to be the inevitability of not only further difficulties in the UK's external relationship with the EU in the next few months, but the inevitability of further internal conflict between the UK government and its devolved counterparts.
Roger, can I ask about the relationship between the Scottish and Welsh governments, which is extraordinary and is extraordinarily useful for Nicola Sturgeon in that it allows her to make her case without being condemned as a rabid nationalist with a wrecking agenda. What are the fault lines in that relationship? You know, when do their interests diverge? At what point does that happen?
Well, I mean, their interests may well diverge on significant amounts of the detail, and when we get into discussing specific policies, you know, Scotland and Wales do not necessarily, on lots of issues, have similar interests. But on this fundamental issue, both governments, take a very similar line. You know, they are not willing to trust the assurances of the UK government. They see what the UK government is doing as encroaching into areas which in the UK are understood as being devolved. They see this explicitly as a power grab. Now, it's interesting that, I mean, the dynamics actually in Wales these days, arguably for almost 100 years, a lot of the most interesting politics that goes on in Wales is internal to the Labour Party, because, you know, they're the long-term dominant party. Carwyn Jones is very much towards the devolutionist and autonomist end of Welsh Labour. And it's quite obvious that, for instance, not every Welsh Labour MP is entirely comfortable, that's putting it quite softly, with him lining up so solidly with an SNP First Minister, an SNP-led Scottish government. But nonetheless, there's been little, if no, real breaking of ranks publicly at the moment, because I suppose obviously still here, you know, party dynamics come into play, and it's an opportunity for the Labour Party to give something to beat UK Conservative government over the head with. But I mean, this is, I think, long-term a fragile alliance between the two devolved governments. But it's, I think, as I said earlier, you know, eloquent testimony to how badly the internal politics have been handled by the UK government, that you can make it possible for Carwyn Jones and Nicola Sturgeon to stand in exactly the same place. Yeah. You know, it ought not to require the greatest degree of political cleverness to be able to detach those two, but, you know, thus far, you know, the UK government has actually pushed those two closer together as allies.
Yeah, good. Iain, your opening remarks, please.
Yeah, well, I genuinely am grateful to Bernard Jenkins. Can you hear me, by the way? Is this coming out? For stating the situation so clearly from his point of view, that these powers which the Scottish Parliament believes it exercises are, in a sense, a kind of fantasy, that they really only derive from the EU, and it's never really exercised power over agriculture. You know, just to repeat, the kind of powers among these 111 which are considered to be at issue over Brexit include things like, you know, GM crops, animal welfare, pesticides control, food standards, food labelling, hydrocarbons, fracking. There's a whole range of very crucial issues which the Scottish Parliament believed were among its responsibilities. And it, you know, no MSP worth their salt is going to accept that these are, as it were, something of a fiction. Now, I'm also grateful for him for explaining the Scotland Act, because very few people really understand or appreciate the radical nature of the Scotland Act 1998, which, unlike previous attempts at devolution, started by saying that we'll only specify the powers that are reserved to Westminster, the central powers, if you like, the federal powers, defence, foreign affairs, overall currency management, drugs, and a couple of other. Abortion was originally one of them as well. Only specify those. Everything else is assumed to be a responsibility of the Scottish Parliament, the devolved Parliament. So it's completely open-ended. I think that's why at conferences like this in recent years, the consensus of most commentators would be that the British Constitution was no longer a purely unitary one, that we had a kind of federalism, a kind of quasi-federal constitution. Obviously, it can't be a full federal constitution because we don't have a written constitution, so there's no specification, but that's the nearest we've got to it, by specifying, as I say, only the powers that reside at Westminster. And that's why this is such a controversial issue in Scotland, and such a central one, because it really does overturn the whole principle of devolution as we understand it. It really drives a coach and horses through the Scotland Act, because Clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Act basically reverses this, and it says that these powers, don't really exist anyway, but, whatever they are, if they do exist, Westminster will basically decide upon them, and thereafter will allocate subsequently powers to the Scottish Parliament. Now, David Lidington has developed this a bit, and he said that of these 111 powers, 86 will go automatically to Holyrood, but 25, the 25 key ones, he hasn't actually specified these yet, but I think we can work out what most of them are. There'll be issues like agriculture, fisheries, and the environment, anything that affects trading standards or would liable to make it difficult to have a coherent UK internal market. I mean, the Scottish government does accept that there is an issue here. That, you couldn't have, for example, Scotland having totally different standards on animal welfare, or on pesticides, or on food labelling, or on GM crops, because it would be, therefore, very difficult for the UK government to strike trade deals with other countries. If you strike a trade deal with America and it involves these infamous chlorinated chickens, they have to be able to, the UK government has to be able to negotiate for the whole of the United Kingdom. Can't just say, well, it's provisional, it depends whether Scotland agrees with us or not. However, this is the situation that exists in the EU, and you may remember how the Belgian Principality of Wallonia held up the CETA, the Canadian EU trade deal last year, because it had a right to be consulted, it had a right of agreement on any trade deals that were set. And that is actually the key issue at the moment, which has come to head this week as the Scottish government has put its EU legal continuity bill, its emergency bill, through the Scottish Parliament. It's all about agreement. The continuity bill boldly says that the powers the Scottish Parliament has at the moment, it will continue to have, and it wasn't originally the SNP who came up with this idea. It was originally the Welsh government who proposed a continuity bill. It's very interesting, as Roger says. It's very interesting here that the nationalist, the Scottish government, which is SNP, has been really riding in the back of the Welsh government. The Scottish government, the SNP, is very ambivalent, always has been very ambivalent about devolution. Many nationalists still regard devolution as a distraction, a deviation from the true path of independence. They don't really want anything to do with it. But now they are actually being forced to argue the case very much for a devolution settlement. And they've been taking, as I say, their lead from Wales on this issue. So they've put this legal continuity bill, which basically freezes the laws as they stand and says, we are going to have these laws. You may say they're a fantasy, and wave them away, but no, they're going to be there in law. We say that as an act of the Scottish Parliament, which poses a challenge to the Westminster Parliament, because ultimately it can overrule that by passing a vote in the Commons, just as it can overrule any attempt by the Scottish Parliament to refuse consent to the EU withdrawal bill when it finally reaches the statute books. But Westminster can ultimately overturn the continuity bill, can overturn and enforce consent from the Scottish Parliament. But I think that what's interesting politically is that I think a lot of people in the Scottish government wonder whether or not Westminster will actually go to those lengths. Because as soon as the Westminster government does vote for that, if it does, it will be making absolutely clear that the Scotland Act of 1998 doesn't apply any longer, that the United Kingdom Constitution has fundamentally changed, and that the Scottish Parliament doesn't really exercise sovereignty any longer in the way it was understood under the original devolution project, but becomes more like a unit of local government, like the old Strathclyde region, because it's exercising powers delegated to it rather than exercising sovereignty in its own right. And that might seem to be a fairly abstract or pointy-headed issue, as they say in Scotland, and maybe it's not talked about very much in the pubs. But, you know, it is an absolutely central issue. And I think it is something we should certainly reflect upon, because ultimately I think, you know, there will be some kind of forced, imposed settlement, if you like, on this issue. But I don't, you know, as I say, the issue, the central issue is one of the nature of agreement, and whether or not these decisions are taken jointly by the Scottish Parliament and Westminster, or whether they're imposed on Holyrood under Clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Bill. And I think, you know, that is an important moment in Britain's constitutional history. And where it parallels the situation in Ireland over the border is, I think, this, that, you know, there was an assumption, the Brexiteers had an assumption that the UK is a unitary state, and therefore it's quite simple for the UK to leave the EU. But that is not the legal situation. This is not a unitary state. You have devolved parliaments which exercise sovereignty in their own right as a result of acts admittedly as a result of acts of the Westminster Parliament, but that sovereignty and those powers are important, and they will be fought for. And I think, you know, that's probably all I have to say about that at the moment.
Okay. Iain, can I ask you about Nicola Sturgeon, okay? Someone you've written about for decades and you know quite well. Does she want a deal? You know, how, you know, or does she want a deal, or does she want the whole thing to collapse in chaos and precipitate a constitutional crisis?
I think they do want a deal. I think they want a deal on, as I said, on agreement. So, in other words, that there will be absolutely clear that, first of all, Clause 11 will be amended, but in such a way as to make clear that in future the Scottish Government's cooperation has to be involved in these issues over who decides about GM crops, for example. Now, the situation at the moment is that Westminster, the UK government doesn't want that, because they don't want to have to allow Scotland to have a veto or even a delaying power, as in the case of Wallonia. But I think she thinks it's quite reasonable, given that that was the situation in Europe, she thinks it's quite reasonable for that to happen in the UK. And I think as a result of this process, she has become more engaged with the issue of devolution. I think she understands now that there is an important logic to this, and that the sovereignty that the Scottish Parliament exercises at the moment is actually quite important and is worth defending.
It's going to be some moment, though, isn't it? But if there's an acceptable fudge on the withdrawal bill that meets most of the Scottish concerns to an acceptable level, she will then be forced to, she'll then have to make a decision as to whether to block the withdrawal bill or to use the legislative consent motion. And if she doesn't block it, then that's Nicola Sturgeon facilitating Brexit, and that will be quite a big moment for her party.
Yeah, I think what happens in Wales will be quite important here. I mean, there's some suggestion that Wales is nearer an agreement than the Scottish government. That if that happens, it will be difficult for her not to strike an agreement, because, you know, as I say, this is not an issue that many people are terribly engaged with, because it seems abstract and constitutional. But you know, if things continue as they are at the moment, I think yes, they will persevere. They will put through they put through the continuity bill. That's going through this week. It's already been voted for by majority in the Scottish Parliament on its principle. It's now going into detail, and that will pass by the Scottish Parliament, and they will withhold legislative consent. Because, as I say, they want to put the onus on Westminster to overturn that and to impose consent because, well, first of all, they're not entirely sure that certainly the Lords would go along with that. I mean, the Lords have themselves said in their own EU committee report last year, the Lords said exactly this, that these powers, as a matter of law, these powers go automatically, they go directly by default to the Scottish Parliament. There's no question about it. And a lot of the Lords, I think, would say, well, you know, we can't just sort of ignore that and pretend that the last 20 years haven't happened. So there is a possibility that Westminster would not overturn the legislative consent motion. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's the politics that's happening at the moment.
Thank you, Iain. Katy, your opening remarks, please.
My father was a GP, and he loved his job, but he used to mention that such a thing as heart sink patients. So somebody would enter the room and his heart would sink into his boots. And I have a feeling that Northern Ireland is a little bit the same as a topic. But I'll try not to inflict a torrent of moaning and misery upon you for the next 5 minutes. Even though devolution isn't functioning terribly well at the moment in Northern Ireland, there's still a lot to talk about. And I'm going to focus on explaining why Brexit makes devolution even more vital for Northern Ireland, and of course why it makes devolution even more difficult in Northern Ireland. To do so, I just want to raise the importance of devolution to the 1998 agreement. So subsidiarity as a principle has been a lifeline for Northern Ireland because it took it out of that destructive cycle which focused upon exclusivist sovereignty, so a choice for Northern Ireland between being closer to Britain or closer to Ireland. Devolution was absolutely core to resolving that. You managed differences, those differences, in pragmatic ways through power sharing and accommodation. And of course, the conflict as well was historically exacerbated by the lack of representation for Northern Ireland in Westminster. Not just, of course, by Sinn Féin MPs not taking up their seats, but most particularly in the fact that the Conservative Party and Labour Party, certainly Liberal Democrats, have really no hold at all in Northern Ireland. So most people, most parties, in fact all parties in Northern Ireland would agree that rule for London solely was both symbolically and materially less than ideal for Northern Ireland. Moving on to the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement. This agreement is not just a Northern Ireland concern. This is fundamental to the United Kingdom itself. The change in the constitution to the United Kingdom that made that agreement possible, or that came in association with that agreement, i.e. devolution to Northern Ireland and then similarly to Wales and Scotland, that change was absolutely vital to making that agreement work. So the multi-layered governance that we see functioning through that agreement depends on devolution first and foremost. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the North-South and then the East-West British-Irish institutions. All of these are interlocking, all of these are interdependent, but functioning devolution is vital to it all. So why does Brexit make devolution more important? Well, I think we see this brought out through the joint report. So bearing in mind that Northern Ireland was considered a vital issue in phase 1 of the negotiations for very good reasons, mainly because the Irish border is not just a technical problem, it takes on a human concern and a concern in relation to peace as well. And Europe recognised this very much so in putting Ireland and Northern Ireland there to the forefront. The joint report of the 8th of December highlighted the possibility of 3 broad scenarios. One of those, the first one, UK-EU free trade agreement, managing to get around the Northern Ireland issue. That really is a non-runner, and we can talk more in the discussion if we have time or if you're vaguely interested. But scenario 2 and 3. So scenario 2, specific solutions for Northern Ireland. Those specific solutions is much more than a technological solution. And then scenario 3, alignment of the rules of the single market and customs union that protect the 1998 agreement and North-South cooperation. So those 2 scenarios depend on devolution functioning within Northern Ireland. And this is for very practical reasons. And we see those practical reasons actually in the protocol in that draft withdrawal agreement. So it talks about areas of North-South cooperation that are vital to protect. They're under the operation of the 98 agreement, but they've also expanded as a result of that agreement and as a result of functioning devolution. So that includes environment, that includes transport, telecommunications, education, health in certain areas. These are very practical, significant ways in which North-South cooperation has functioned to material benefit and which makes sense to work on an all-island basis with no barriers in the Irish Sea. The last point, why does Brexit make devolution more difficult? Well, fundamentally because we have exogenous change for the whole functioning of devolution within Northern Ireland. The tension between the British and Irish government and the kind of language that's being used to describe each other is really very, very damaging to the spirit and the implementation of the 98 agreement. Particularly if we think that the role that the British and Irish government have played, even as we've seen in the last 10 years, when they've taken their eye off the ball a little bit for Northern Ireland, has been one of leading and giving confidence to unionism and nationalism in finding accommodation. If there's tension in that relationship, we have a serious problem within Northern Ireland. Also, of course, Brexit means the exit from the common union legal and political frameworks that have facilitated that North-South cooperation and indeed East-West cooperation in several areas. And of course, it puts the border back on the table. Then, of course, we come into internal tensions within Northern Ireland. And there's a context of great uncertainty, and we don't do uncertainty terribly well in Northern Ireland. Automatically, it means an appeal to the hard line, which automatically means that compromise becomes much more toxic and much more difficult to sell. There's a reliance on rhetoric. We see that reliance on rhetoric at the highest levels of government, rhetoric as a substitute for action and decision-making. And in Northern Ireland, we're very good at hyperbole and rhetoric, and it generally doesn't take us closer together. So this is a real problem. And then finally, of course, there's a decreased incentivization for power sharing itself. And this is being played out very publicly in the positions being taken by Sinn Féin and the DUP. Really, they have to ask the question, is it worth it? Is it worth us coming in, making this public compromise with this other party who we're at odds with in so many different ways? And I was in a meeting recently with one party. We try and speak to them all. But we were meeting with one party, and they said, really, you couldn't expect us to, as one of the two, rather, trying to find agreement on restoring devolution, you couldn't expect us to agree about Brexit. Because I said, what's going to happen if we do get executive up and running? We're not going to agree on Brexit. It's like trying to ask us to agree about the union. We're never going to agree on this. And we're going to have to rely on officials to do most of the decision making. So to conclude, Northern Ireland is an intractable issue, certainly, if you frame it as being an either-or binary British-Irish choice. It becomes no longer that intractable issue if you frame it in much more multi-layered and complex, nuanced terms. The Brexit debate has had a centrifugal effect. Devolution and proper representation of a wider range of voices within Northern Ireland is the only thing that can run counter to that centrifugal dynamic. And so I would return to this question of the rhetoric being used by the UK government. So the only solution that we might have within Northern Ireland is one that involves differentiation. And this isn't anything terribly radical. This is something that already exists. Devolution, as my colleagues have already said, exists within the United Kingdom. It's not a unitary state per se. And the only way in which we can have a resolution to the situation in Northern Ireland and indeed begin to manage Brexit in an orderly way is to restore regional level power and competence as a means of strengthening rather than weakening the union.
Thank you, Katy. What you were saying there about the conversations you've been having with other parties, I immediately thought of a conversation I had recently with someone from the Scotland office. And they are dreading the return of power sharing in Northern Ireland because their fear is that the minute that happens, all negotiations up to this point are null and void, and they all have to be renegotiated with the Northern Irish point of view. But you seem to be suggesting that Northern Ireland is incapable of the compromises that are necessary for Brexit? Is there a case where, is there a case for saying it's in everyone's best interests that direct rule continues?
No, Northern Ireland isn't incapable of compromise. I think.
Oh, the necessary compromise in this case?
On the Brexit issue. Well, what you would do, so the SDLP have proposed that we have a Brexit minister, and it would probably be maybe an Alliance Party member.
Right.
That would probably be the only way of managing it. So, yes, I mean, there are several questions there about how the civil servants manage power sharing, actually, when we have an executive up and running, and how that restrains or shapes and limits decision-making and in certain ways. But certainly I wouldn't say that compromise is made less possible through power sharing. We have to have that power sharing in order to find an agreement for Northern Ireland that would enable us to manage Brexit in a bit more democratic way.
Okay, thank you, Katy. Dan, your remarks, please.
Thanks very much. I'm going to start off with a wee moment of indulgence. I took some satisfaction in the first couple of panels this morning in recognising that those discussions were really framed as discussions of politics in England. And I take that satisfaction as someone based at Cardiff University who's collaborated for the past 7 or 8 years with colleagues at Edinburgh University to conduct a survey, the Future of England survey. What was still lacking a bit, I think, this morning was any real discussion of the English as the English. It's hardly surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising, that people in England feel English. But that insight hasn't really animated political science research and survey research in quite the way one might have expected that it would have done. So I'm going to talk about England and Englishness, and I want to have 3 things in mind as I go through these brief remarks. The first thing is that Englishness has had important political effects, including especially in the Brexit referendum. The second thing is that Englishness remains sort of unstable or not fully articulated as a political identity. It lacks institutional expression. So there's no equivalent in England of the SNP or really of the Scottish Parliament. And the third thing to say is that national identities in England are very complicated. About 3/4 of people in England are strongly nationalist. About 3/4 of people in England feel strongly English. But about 3/4 of people in England also feel strongly British. So these are complicated identities that combine in difficult ways. And in the remainder of my remarks, I'm going to take these 3 points in reverse order. So thinking about English national identity, well, the first thing to say about it is it's kind of national, right? In the sense that it is expressed and espoused in pretty much the same way right across the territory of England. London's an exception, but for example, in the 2011 census, where the numbers seem peculiarly large compared to most survey evidence, an English-only identity was chosen between 62 and 70% of people outside London in England, 37% of people in London. Only between 20 and 28% of people describe themselves as not English in the census. 56% of people in London. And in those numbers, the northeast was the high and the southeast was the low. In one of our Future of England surveys, in a forced choice question between English and British identity, 41 to 48% of people chose English as their primary identity, and only 34% in London. Englishness is kind of caught between local government and devolution. The other forms of devolution, particularly in Wales and Scotland, we can have the debate in Northern Ireland, but they're essentially national in character. There's a very strong policy case to strengthen local government in England. Although there is a kind of devolution paradox, some of the material in the report behind this event today identifies that most people would like the UK government to do most things. When you ask people about policies in particular, they'll very often say they want the UK level to to take responsibility for the policy, but that doesn't necessarily chime with their sense that they actually want devolved government as well. The problem is that decentralisation as devolution doesn't address the national character of Englishness. And this may be partly the point for some people. Some people who espouse forms of decentralising devolution in England may find Englishness a kind of distasteful or sort of infra-dig identity. It's seen by some people as a kind of unattractive identity. The difficulty with that is that for people who feel English, that's not going to help to address their political discontent, and they are quite discontent, including about Westminster. There aren't any easy solutions then for English national identity. I started by saying it's had political impacts. So, for example, in the 2015 election, Prime Minister Cameron, as he then was, made a pretty clear appeal to English identity when he talked about a coalition of chaos and Ed Miliband being put in power but supported behind the scenes by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. He also appealed to a Carlyle principle that Scottish devolution shouldn't have any detrimental effects elsewhere in the UK. But I think these appeals are or have been kind of temporary. They haven't been mobilized into a sustained party political identity. There was a period when, despite its name, UKIP looked as if it might have the makings of a kind of party of England, but of course UKIP has collapsed, and in our most recent research, it's actually the Labour Party that has not a majority support, but the largest number of English respondents regarding it as the party that best stands up for the needs of the English. So if Englishness can have political impacts, what then of the future and this kind of post-Brexit world? Well, in some of our most recent survey, we've had some fairly stark data. So if we look at Leavers, people who support Leave in England, it turns out that 81% of them and 87% of Conservative Leavers are willing to have the Northern Ireland peace process destabilised in order to get the form of Brexit they want. 88% of Leavers and 92% of Conservative Leavers would countenance the departure of Scotland in the interest of getting the kind of Brexit that they'd like. So this unchanneled, uninstitutionalized identity, it seems to me potentially, at least, has really quite dramatic political consequences. Of course, when we asked people these questions, we were putting something that seemed tangible, the Brexit negotiations, up against what might seem more hypothetical challenges. So I wouldn't want to run these numbers or an argument based on these numbers too hard, but I still think there's something important to consider and address that doesn't get sufficiently addressed in the wider public debate.
Thank you, Dan. Can I ask you, on Brexit, who speaks for England? And in particular, is there a conflict of interest for Whitehall ministers? Are they being asked to kind of speak for England, to be English ministers, because their responsibilities are many of them have only English responsibilities, and also to be part of the UK government making decisions on a UK basis?
Well, I think that tension runs through Brexit, but it runs through many other things. I mean, in the previous plenary, we heard about the kind of apocryphal post-it, don't forget the DAs. That notion of business as usual in Whitehall and the ministers who run those departments runs through our politics and certainly is significant in Brexit. There is, I think, a tension between speaking for the union as a whole or trying to speak for the union as a whole and this English leave constituency.
And who currently at this moment on Brexit speaks for England?
I'm not sure anyone does. So
right.
That's the point.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. I'm going to take two comments from the floor at the same time, and then ask the panel to chip in as and when they want to, rather than go through a very formal process. If you, I've been asked on a bit of housekeeping to say that if to wait for the microphone to come to you, and when the microphone does come to you, to hold it very close to your mouth, because we're having problems with the acoustics. Got a gentleman there. There's right there. That's.
I just want to clarify something that Bernard Jenkins said, which I think wasn't correct, because it relates to everything we've talked about today. The Scottish Government and the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Government have had 20 years of management competencies and control over cohesion policy. In fact, most of England from 1997 to 2010 were under the government officers of the region, also had those competencies. They were technically shared management with Whitehall and also with Brussels, but the idea that they've not had those powers is not actually correct. It's 20 years where they have had the powers, and that's in programming, delivery, and monitoring and evaluation. It's just a technical point, but in terms of the urban regional and the governance issues, I think this is very, very important.
Okay. More comments? Lady here. Thank you.
Hi, Catherine Simpson from Manchester Metropolitan University. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for a really brilliant panel. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is to Katy, and they're two very kind of short and sweet questions. I suppose the one question I'd like to ask is, with a year now till we leave the European Union, would it be better to, say, have no Northern Ireland executive, or kind of how we have now, or would it actually be helpful to have direct rule in going forward in Brexit negotiations? And I suppose the second thing is, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, is that given the fact that DUP and Sinn Féin can't agree on Brexit, and you said in your talk that they've compared it to the Union, is it actually better that we don't have an executive in Northern Ireland at the moment for Brexit negotiations?
Katy, do you want to just address that? Thanks.
Yes, so, no, I think it'd be, I was interested to hear Bernard say in response to the question that he thought the devolution matter in Northern Ireland wouldn't be resolved till Brexit is resolved, and that wasn't terribly reassuring. I think we need to get an executive up and running as soon as possible, and it needs to remain a priority. And bear in mind that the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, they are essentially, in principle, they're equal. So whatever should be coming out from Northern Ireland will be something that would be agreed between them. And they can agree. There's loads of common points in which they agree. So even if you look at the DUP's manifesto and what it says in terms of a single phytosanitary regime for the island of Ireland, single electricity market, there's loads of stuff there in which they agree with Sinn Féin. Language is an issue in terms of special status. And also, of course, bear in mind that the letter that Martin McGuinness and Eileen Foster wrote in August 2016 to the Prime Minister set out several areas in which there is essentially asking for bespoke arrangements for Northern Ireland. And at that point, I think the understanding was that the UK would approach it differently and that the devolves would have more of a say in the shape of the Brexit negotiations. But I do think that's something to bear in mind, that has been agreed already, that there is a lot of actual common ground in pragmatic terms between them. And that we'll only get back to that pragmatism with devolution up and running. Direct rule, especially giving up on the idea of devolution is a really, it's only a negative thing, I think.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Gentleman here is patient, then we'll go to Mr. Curtis. Sir John.
Sheldon, University of Cambridge. I agree with the analysis of much of the panel that trust is the big issue between the UK and devolved governments over the withdrawal bill and Clause 11 issue. But I think it must be recognised that the trust issue does go both ways. I think that the reason that the UK government having made some concessions, haven't been willing to go all the way and concede exactly what the Scottish and Welsh governments have demanded is that they don't trust the Scottish and Welsh governments not to pursue policies that diverge from the UK's priorities during the process of negotiating frameworks, and also perhaps don't trust them to fully participate in the process of agreeing frameworks without wanting to, again, exercise their leverage to the maximum. So I suppose my question is, how can all of the governments restore a trusting relationship between the UK's governments ahead of a period during the negotiation of the substantive frameworks on agriculture, fisheries and so on, when actually cooperative intergovernmental relations will probably be more important than ever during the history of UK devolution.
Okay, thank you. John.
John Curtis, Strathclyde University, and Arts and Social Research. I really just want to lob something at Dan so he can say a little bit more. In your remarks, Dan, you said that, in a sense, there wasn't any political representation or movement that was clearly representing Englishness. That's undoubtedly true, but can I suggest that maybe one of the clues to understanding where we are, and perhaps essential to understanding the role of national identity in England vis-à-vis the EU referendum, is that what has been represented in England is Britishness. And that within England, although not necessarily in Scotland or in Wales, Britishness has been effectively presented as a multicultural identity. And that therefore one of the reasons why, A, you get the geographical disparities to which you referred to, for example, between London and the rest of the UK, is that we know that we know from the survey evidence that both you and I collect, that virtually nobody who identifies as something other than white, so they identify as black, or Asian, whatever, identifies as English. Same is not true in Scotland, the same is not necessarily true in Wales. So that therefore, and then this takes us to the EU referendum, because of course we know that immigration is a central issue in the referendum. And that therefore the reason why you get this correlation between identity in England and EU vote is because it's reflecting the way in which Britishness is a multicultural identity, therefore one that's very favourable towards EU membership, and Englishness is not. But if that analysis is correct, do we not then therefore need to be careful about assuming that this awakenedness, if this is the right word, of Englishness in the EU referendum necessarily tells us anything about the extent to which England wishes to be represented via one or other of the many devolution processes that are being talked about south of the border?
Thank you, John. Do you want to address that, Dan, directly? Sorry, can I ask you briefly? We're being told to wind up this debate, so I'm going to keep the remarks brief.
I mean, I agree with a good deal of what John has just said. I'm not in the business of proposing institutional solutions for the English. I'm happy to think about those that others propose. My only concern there is that I think Britishness does have a multicultural aspect to it, in England in particular, in a way that Englishness doesn't in England. But I think Britishness is quite a capacious identity in which people who feel English and people who don't feel English find different places, but may all express, for example, a strong sense of Britishness. whether that's allied to an English identity or not. So, as I said at the beginning, these identities are quite complex and entangled, I think, in England. It takes quite a lot to pull the elements out. I've also got some thoughts about the next question.
Do you put them on ice and address them to him afterwards? Because anybody else want to pick? Iain, do you want to pick them on the trust issue? Because I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to say that why should we trust Nicola Sturgeon when only last year she was threatening another referendum on independence?
Well, exactly, and trust is a two-way street, and you saw that with Bernard Jenkins' contributions today, when he says, well, they didn't really have these powers anyway. You know, that it doesn't really matter. The Scotland Act was a bit of a nonsense. It may be, you know, maybe in statute, but we don't really want to sort of look at that. We'll just pretend it never happened. And that, you know, the United Kingdom is a unitary state, when clearly it hasn't been for the last 20 years. So you can see why there is a problem of trust on both sides. Now, I'm sure it can be resolved, but it would have to be resolved along the lines of the Scottish Parliament, I think, still having control over some of the responsibilities it already exercises under the sort of ultimate authority of Brussels. I'm thinking about things like genetically modified crops, fracking, animal welfare, things like pesticides. I mean, you know, these are pretty important matters in Scotland, and they are quite widely discussed. And there would be a lot of concern if these responsibilities were taken away, and these things could be imposed on Scotland in a way they couldn't have been imposed in the past. And you know, that's what agreement would mean, that they would have to be give and take on both sides. I mean, that happens in the EU because, you know, it's not just the 27, there's a 38 sort of legislative or representative bodies which have to be consulted whenever there's trade agreements. That's why the Wallonia situation happened. If that could take place in Europe, they don't see any reason why that shouldn't happen here. That's a trust issue as well, but it's one which doesn't go one way. And you could clearly hear from Bernard Jenkins, which I think is the authentic voice, if you like, of the Brexit government, which is that Brexit needs a unitary state. Anything that gets in the way of that must be removed, including this sovereignty of the Scottish Parliament and the Scotland Act. So, you know, it is a very important question. They have to resolve it ultimately, if there's going to be agreement, either by imposing it or else by saying, yes, Scotland will have. And sometimes the term co-determination is used rather inappropriately, but the idea there is that it's not just going one way, that both sides have to agree if there's something like GM crops to be part of a trade deal in future.
Final word to you, Roger, on what do you want to pick up on?
Well, I think they want to counter the next panel, so I agree trust has to be a two-way street. In the case of the Welsh government, I think they do want to reach agreement. I think it's a measure of how badly things have been handled that they've ended up in such a contrary position. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry we had to cut that short, but the whole day's overrun, so we've been at the brunt end of it. But thank you for your contributions, and thank you to our panel this afternoon.